Hi, this is Robert Chair with another edition of the Ray and Bob Show. Ray being the famous Ray McGovern, who was with the CIA for 27 years, and he was in Army intelligence before that. And he was, in fact, in charge among the analysts at the CIA of the old Soviet Union desk. He's fluent in Russian. He was recently in that country, spoke at a forum shortly before Vladimir Putin did, and we looked like we were heading to some kind of peace negotiations under President Trump's urging between Ukraine and Russia. That fell apart with Ukraine's attack on Russian nuclear bombers and on the bridge in Crimea. I'm going to let Ray talk about that, but I do want to ask you one specific question. Now, Donald Trump responded to that. He talked to Putin for an hour today. I want to get your response to that. But just to understand the seriousness of the attack on those bombers, those are part of the triad of nuclear defense that the U.S. and Russia maintain. And the bombers are the ones we're supposed to prefer because at least they can be called back once in flight and they're not as vulnerable to an instant attack. That's why there's a triad, and there's also the submarine fleet, and there's the missiles. And if the missiles are taken out, then the bombers were supposed to be some sort of reassurance, and you could all say it was an accident, but at least you haven't wiped out their total force. So this was a pretty serious attack. And could it have been done without European support? I mean, I know it required ingenuity in smuggling in these drones, but is it possible that Trump didn't know about it? As he
Yeah,
indicates in his response that he didn't.
well, it's almost sure that he didn't. This was conceived a year and a half ago by those geniuses that Biden employed. I'm thinking of Jake Sullivan and what's that fellow, Tony Blinken. They're the ones that planned the destruction of Nord Stream 2. They tell the CIA what to do, and it's entirely conceivable that they were at least in on these plans. Now, my guess, it's an educated guess, but it is just a guess because I don't have any real good evidence except circumstantial evidence, is that the British were in the lead on this. Why do I say that? Well, the British have this special relationship with Zelensky. MI6 writes his speeches. They do all kinds of things like trying to blow up that bridge in Crimea. The British really like to blow up things. I mean, and they're very good at it. I mean, let's face it. In World War II, there was a big morale boost when the British blew up this or that in occupied France or in Germany. It's oh my God, it didn't make a zero difference with respect to the war, but it enhanced morale. And so, in many respects, this is a joint British Zelensky morale boost. Was it clever? It sure was. Was it embarrassing to Putin? It sure as hell was. And the security services are certainly going to be called on the carpet about this, and they should be. But in the grand scheme of things, just as these blowing up of things during World War II by the British, this time it's not going to make any difference. And those airfields, well, yeah, they housed some of these bombers, but some of those bombers also used conventional weaponry to hit Ukraine. So, there's a certain logic in trying to hit those. And the bad thing, of course, is that those aircraft were eminently hittable, parked wing to wing, for God's sake, on the tarmac, because those are the requirements of the SALT and START treaties. In other words, they're required to be out there so that imagery from satellites can verify that they're in compliance with the provisions of these treaties. So when you knock a couple of those things out, it's a little different from knocking other things out. But in my view, not much different. I don't think this brings us closer to nuclear war. I don't think that Putin is going to be provoked at upping the ante here. And so well, let me just tell you that Last night, I got a call about this time actually from the head of Consortium News. He said, "Ray, do you think this is a, um, a key moment, an Oreshnik movement that they're saying? In other words, there's going to be hell break loose because of these tracks." I said, "No, I don't think they're silly. Well, why do you think they're saying that?" Well, I give them credit. They've looked into the Soviet doctrine about nuclear warfare, and you can connect the dots there to say, oh, they could be provoked. They could use this particular provision to say we've been attacked, one of our triads been attacked. But I don't give much thought to this. This is a whole different plane of things. He says, well, you're right. I said, well, do you agree with my drift? Yeah. So at 10 o'clock last night, I put pen to paper, so to speak, and I had something to him by 1, which published today. And I dare say that I'm relieved when I heard what the various Russians were saying earlier today in Moscow. And then when Putin was quoted as saying the things that he did, well, they dovetail nicely with what I predicted in my piece on Consortium News. And let me hasten to add, I have no direct contact with Vladimir Putin, and so he wasn't in McGovern's pocket in any way, nor was I in his pocket. But the whole thing was Putin would not be provoked. Okay, this was idea to provoke Putin from canceling the talks the next day in Istanbul. And he said in this readout, no, I wouldn't let myself be provoked to doing that. The other thing was that the Europeans, and particularly the British, would very much like to provoke Putin into doing such damage in Ukraine, such an acceleration or such a big difference in terms of the offensive capability that the U.S. can't back out. That the U.S. can't say that's it. The U.S. would be too embarrassed. It'd be too cowardly looking for the U.S. to opt out in those circumstances. Neither of those work. Now, the only fly in the ointment is Donald Trump. My wife asked me before, well, Trump says that Putin's going to have to retaliate. Well, yeah, he will have to retaliate, but it's not what they were trying to provoke those Ukrainians and what I call the what is it the people who like Stormer and Merz and Hollande and Macron. They're trying to stoke the fires of this thing. They didn't do it. In other words, the title of this thing was what? Putin did not rise to the bait. And that's pretty much what the readout, the Russian readout of the conversation today. The only real difference in the readout is, well, there are two. One is um, Trump says it went for an hour and 15 minutes. Ushakov says it only went for an hour and 10 minutes. But more important, Putin says nothing about retaliation. That's Donald Trump. I'd prefer to look and analyze the words of Putin's representative rather than Donald Trump. I'm sure Putin said, "Look, we're going to have to continue to inflict damage and retaliation," but I still think that the retaliation will be measured, and that as long as those talks keep going, and the Ushakov, the Putin side, said that they made some progress, and justifiably so, then the talks will continue, and meanwhile the Russians will move west in Ukraine, and the Ukrainian army will probably fall apart within the next couple of months. I'll just finish by saying the head of Ukrainian army intelligence said about this time last year that if nothing changes in about June, that's now. In about June of next year, we're going to run out of equipment, run out of soldiers. And indeed, the Russians have advanced more quickly and deeper than they have heretofore. And it's a canard to say that the Russians are losing or that the Russians have only inched forward. The Russians have gone slow. They continue to go slow because the idea is not to take territory, but to destroy the Ukrainian army. That's called demilitarization. That's one of the chief aims. And as I say, it's about to occur. What needs to happen to let Trump a little bit easier off is when it's clear that the Ukrainians no longer resist. Putin has to be flexible enough to, well, let's put it this way. We talk about putting lipstick on a pig. Well, the pig of defeat for the West and for the US and for the Ukrainians, the defeat in Ukrainian, I think that Putin will be happy to supply as much lipstick as is needed to disguise the fact that the one lost and the other one lost, the other won, and there's a lot of flexibility that I see in Russia's position. Doesn't want to take all of Ukraine, just wants a deal where it doesn't have to rule all of Ukraine, but that the the, the West recognize the core interests of Russia, and first and foremost, Ukraine cannot be a part of NATO.
So, but foreign policy, foreign affairs
I
magazine,
can't hear you, Bob.
foreign affairs magazine, and others. No, they're presenting this as a game changer in the war.
Hmm.
And they're saying, look, these bombers, first of all, were used to attack Ukraine,
Right.
that they cost billions of dollars. And after all, what Trump's main argument with uh, Zelensky was, you've lost, you better get used to it. Now, Zelensky can say, we can do real damage, we can take them on, and that we've got ingenuity on our side. And I'm just wondering. I know you know a hell of a lot more than I do about all this stuff, but there is, those planes. They're old and they're part of but they were being used now, and it just shows. I mean, there's no question. It shows a certain Russian vulnerability, and it will encourage Ukraine to keep fighting, and it might even help them with recruiting and getting support from the population. So I don't know, but that's the way it's being reported. And
Mhm.
it's not unusual to find your viewpoint different than the mainstream. And I say you got a great track record of having been proved right. You certainly were in the long course of what's happened in Ukraine. You certainly call that, in terms of the superiority of the Russian military and its population size and everything else. But even Donald Trump, in his comments on Truth Social, said we're not going to get peace that quickly. Now, he's a guy who campaigned saying he would get peace very quickly. Does this mean he can't control the European allies of Ukraine? Does it mean he can't control Ukraine? What is your sense of how this plays out?
The most important thing, Bob, is that the Russians today made it very clear that they're considering all these attacks, the ones on the bridges and the ones against the airfields, as acts of terrorism. Okay, and that puts them in a different category than battlefield casualties. Terrorism means something special in Russian law, and what they're saying is, these are terrorist pricks, and they're going to. I mean, they're the little pricks by the terrorists, and they're going to not make much difference. That's what the Russians say. I hate to say it, but the commentators and the press are less credible than what the Russians are doing. At least the Russians are playing it this way. They're not saying, look, this is not a big deal. This is a bunch of terrorist activity. Those bridges that were blown, well, that was really an act of terrorism. Of course, arguably they were, because they were designed to hurt and kill civilians. Now, one interesting thing, Bob, that I should have mentioned before is that when all this came to light, when Lavrov, the foreign minister, saw what was happening, he no doubt talked to Putin, and Putin said, call Rubio. Now, that's different. Now, why should that be different? because Sergei Lavrov didn't know Blinken's telephone number to call him. And if he got the number, his teenage daughter was probably on the phone. This is big deal, okay? What happens? Lavrov calls Rubio, immediately gets his attention, and says, "Hey, what's going on here? What happens? Rubio immediately says, "Oh, we know about those bridges that were blown. We express condolences for the civilians that died in those terrible acts, and we don't think that's right." Now that's in the readout, okay? What else did Lavrov say? I'm sure he said, he said, uh, "Mr. Secretary, did you know about this?" And I'm sure the answer was, beats that. No, nobody told me about this. How about your president? I doubt it. He never mentioned it to me. I guess I'll go ask. Okay. Well, now, as you know, today Trump has said that he didn't know anything about this. Is that conceivable? It is indeed. These are the guys that planned, as I said before, the Nord Stream 2 pipeline destruction. They could easily have joined the British in this very artful, let's face it, very embarrassing for the Russians, major operation that took a year and a half. And now they hit two of those five bases. They destroyed maybe at tops 9 or 10 of those aircraft, probably more than five. How many do the Russians have? 55 or 60? Is this going to put a dent in their capability? The answer is no. So you're right. The Russians had the chance to play this up and say, look, nuclear, nuclear, nuclear. This is the triad. This is terrible. But they didn't do that. Who did it? Well, well meaning analysts in this country who looked up nuclear doctrine, the revised nuclear doctrine that the Soviets had said, oh my God, look at this paragraph here. The Russians could easily invoke that paragraph. Oh my God. But the Russians didn't invoke that paragraph. They played it down. And Ushakov, I keep mentioning him, he's the right hand person to Putin on these matters. And he's the one that gives the readout. And he just did. I've underlined some of the things here. Maybe I just quote just a couple of things. Yeah, Donald Trump, according to Ushakov, again confirmed that the Americans were not informed about this in advance. Okay, um, Putin spoke approvingly of the second round of the negotiations resumed in Istanbul. He said, "Look, they tried to provoke us not to go to Istanbul. That didn't work, and we didn't retaliate in the way that everybody expected." And this is equally interesting. Naturally, says Ushakov, the leaders agreed to continue and further contacts on the Ukrainian story, including at the highest level, president to president, as well as at other levels and through other channels. Now, that's different. Okay, that's different. And why is that the case? Because both Putin and Trump have placed priority on improving Russian American relations. Now, I'm still a little confused as to why that should be the case, but they have. It's clear in the words and in the deeds. And so at the end, they say, look, the conversation was positive and productive according to both sides. Both sides are going to remain in contact with each other, including the presidents, and as an aside, says Ushakov, both President Trump and President Putin praised the efforts of Representative Stephen Witkoff. So they're making believe that, not making, they're taking the attitude that, look, this is terrorism. You expect this from Zelensky regime. Yeah, we're going to retaliate, but it's not what you're thinking. We're not going to drop any Oreshniks on Ukraine. Now, Oreshniks are not nuclear weapons, but they are very, very, very powerful, and there's no defense against them. So what I see is both sides are going to inch forward. The Russians are going to win, and it depends on how soon the Ukrainians recognize that they've killed enough of their young kids and that they're not going to win, and they should make the best deal they can. And then I think, and I'm an outlier on this, I think Putin has the flexibility to cause the kind of arrangements that will enable Trump and others to walk away saying, well, we got something too, rather than have abject, unconditional surrender.
So, last point here, again, playing to your expertise, there were two responses from the Russians. One was
A little louder, Bob.
there were two responses from the Russians as I read it. Two packages offered. One that they could just get into the direct argument about the four provinces and NATO and so forth. But he had another package, right? I may be wrong about this. Another way to go. They could agree on some basic principles, and then,
Well, yeah, it
yeah.
had to do with a ceasefire. In other words, there are a couple of ways you could get at a ceasefire and conditions that would make it a good idea. But the package was a three-port thing. We have the text now. There are no surprises in it, none at all. And of course, the Ukrainian negotiators have it, and the Russians have what the Ukrainians gave them. So that's progress. That's progress at Istanbul. Now, the Ukrainians once said they were going to go home and study this and come back in a week or 2 weeks and talk about it some more. That too is different. In other words, they're talking. And what Putin or his representative was saying is, look, they try to provoke the Russians on the 1st of June to just diss the negotiations and say, no, we're out of here, and take all the opprobrium that would accrue to them. And we foxed them out. We said, no, no, we continue the negotiations. And once again, Bob, it's really important that Trump and Putin are personally interested in having these negotiations take place. Let me refer to proof of that. When I left Moscow on the 10th of May, okay, that was a Saturday. On Sunday, it became clear that Putin wanted to make a statement, okay, and he gathered all the media that was still in Moscow for victory in Europe celebrations at 2 o'clock in the morning. And what did he say? He said this: "Those people in Europe have said to us, unconditional ceasefire for 30 days or else." And or else was bone crushing sanctions. Okay. And we give you till Monday. Now, here's Putin at 2 o'clock on Sunday morning talking to the press, and he says, well, I got a better idea. I'm sending my team, my negotiating team, the same one that came to an initial agreement back in April of 2022. I'm sending them uh, to Istanbul on Thursday. We hope that the Ukrainians will come. Whoa! What happens the next day? Trump. Great idea, Vladimir. I support that. We'll cooperate with that and try to encourage the Ukrainians to reciprocate. So what happens? They show up. So it was this teamwork that's happening is really bizarre. But Putin and Trump have a mutual interest in tamping this thing down. They have an appreciation of, I mean, they've talked for hours now. I'm sure that Putin has tutored uh, Trump in ways that he's not been tutored before by the media or by his closest intelligence advisors. He's getting the straight story. He happens to have credibility in Putin, and so do I. You look at his record. And my glass half or more full stands, and I recognize that I'm still an outlier among my colleagues, my other intelligence analysts, but I think there's a lot of evidence that the way this was handled with Lavrov and Secretary of State Rubio, and then the top guys talking, and yeah, Trump said, he's going to respond. He's going to have to respond. Of course, he is. The press, in my view, is playing that particular point
Last
out of
one, though,
perspective.
and I said the other one was last one, but this really will be. In that statement, there was an intriguing statement by President Trump that he wants that Russia offered to be helpful in the negotiations about Iran's nuclear weapon, and that he welcomed that Putin could play a role in getting the negotiation through where Iran would have to give up any possibility of a weapon. Did you attach any significance to that?
Yeah, I did. I mean, this is bizarre. Russia's going to be on Iran's side. The only thing that they share, the Russians with the Americans, is a desire to prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. Now, Trump can rant and rave about we're going to prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon, but they are not working on a nuclear weapon, according to our intelligence agencies, saying that since 2007, saying they stopped in 2003. So, what are they trying to get? A limit on refinement and that kind of thing. Those things are doable, but once Trump gets the Russians in on this, that's not going to help the U.S. negotiating position. And as you know, Iran has a treaty now with Moscow, and it's short of a defense treaty, but they're getting all kinds of air defense and other weaponry from Russia. And if the Israelis try something on Iran now, they're going to get a really bloody nose to the point where I think they might resort to the Samson option, pulling down the temple on top of themselves by unleashing nuclear war. The Israelis have nuclear weapons, as we all know. My God! So what I hope will happen is that Putin's companionship with Trump in this will be a salutary development, and it surprises me that Trump would raise this with Putin. Hey, maybe you could help us with the Iranians. Well, yeah, I think he can help, but I think he could help Trump see reason here and note that whatever Trump is being told by the neocons, that Iran has decided not to make a nuclear weapon, and the rest is just marginal stuff that they can have bigger and better inspections and all that kind of stuff. It's a well, number one, it's a neocon dream to destroy Iran. And number two, Iran is absolutely no threat to the United States of America. The Israelis think they're a threat to Israel. Well, yeah, they would be if the Israelis attacked them.
So finally, and just so we can scratch some optimism here, there is a reordering of the plates in international affairs. And what Trump did on that trip, the first trip out, to go to the Emirates and and make nice with Saudi Arabia, he knows that the old Sunni Shiite split is history. And China deserves a lot of credit for pulling that off, but getting the Saudis and the Iranians to not be dwelling on the religious dispute and recognize they have some common interests in not being pushed around or have their region pushed around. So if you see it that way, I'm going to end on this. If you think I'm off base, straighten me out because I wasn't in the CIA for 27 years studying this stuff. But it seemed to me that that's a reflection of a new realism that Trump has been told by the Saudis they don't need Iran in a bloody war and with all the fallout, radioactive and everything else that can come from that. So I don't know. Is this a positive point on which to end? Give
Well,
peace a
I
try.
don't see any positives in the Middle East, Bob. I'm fixated on uh, genocide. Uh, I just can't conceive of our country still supporting genocide and enabling it, and we could stop it.
So
And I think this
finally, what's the word on that ship that's trying to get in?
ah the flotilla.
Yeah.
Well, you could track it. There's a website, U.S. Boat to Gaza. I didn't track it today, but it's about 3 days out now, so it's about halfway to Gaza. What's interesting, Bob, and what I think they know, I've told them, but I'm not sure it got through. They're about to arrive on a very significant anniversary, and that is June 8th. June 8th, the anniversary of the shooting up of the USS Liberty by Israeli airplanes and torpedo boats, killing 34 sailors and wounding 174 other sailors. Now, that's a day that goes down in infamy, the more so since the U.S. has never criticized Israel for doing it, even though we have intercepted messages pilot to a control tower. But that's an American flag. There's big American flags on it. Do it. Carry out your orders. Shoot that up. Okay. So uh, here's a an irony here. We'll have a un, unmanned. I mean, not unmanned, but no weapons on this latest U.S. boat to Gaza, which is a part of a flotilla that's been going every year since 2008. What will happen? Will they get in? Okay. Now, one person I was talking to, well, that's kind of feckless, you know. They're going to get turned back. The Israelis going to impound what they're bringing the food and everything, and they'll be put in jail. So you know. And I told them, well, you know, uh, I take my lessons from a fellow named Dan Berrigan, who tutored me on such things. And what he said was that when he was in that Catonsville post office after they did their first major act in burning those or pouring blood over those draft cards, he described his thought process in his autobiography. It's terrific. He says, you know, I had to think this through. Is what we just did worth doing? I'm going to be called a commie. I'm going to be called the Jesuits probably throw me out of the order. They didn't, but they just sent them to South America. But you know what's they're going to say? I'm really stupid. And then I thought, says Dan, you know, it is true that the good is worth doing because it's good. Now, results are not unimportant, but they're secondary to the goodness of the act. So you do the act, and you look around at the comrades that are with you doing these acts. And you take solace in the fact that you don't know what the exact results are, but they may be good. And in any case, you're doing the good act. And then Dan, being a poet and a humorist, says, just then the door flew open and 4 FBI inspectors entered portentously. He said, and their head was a Dick Tracy type with a jet jawed beard, and he said, "Oh, look over the 9 of us." And he saw my brother Phil still in his clerics, right? He looked at Phil and he said, "You again? I'm going to change my religion." So Dan writes in his book, no higher compliment could come to my brother Phil. So why do I mention that? It's just that you have to keep your sense of humor and all this stuff. You have good companions. You do the thing because it's good, and you let the results go up and where they. You don't worry too much about the results. The results will come. It's just that you don't know exactly how they're going to come. That's
Yeah.
how I come at it, and that's how I think the people on that flotilla. Some of them very close friends of mine, like Ian Wright, and I just hope they weren't blown out of the water.
All right. We'll keep following that and come back with another one of these sessions. Take care.
Thank you, Bob.